Hello everybody, my name is David and I'm certified in CKA, CKAD and CKS. In today's video I want to talk about how to pass the CKA exam. The CKA exam is a practical exam. This means that you are going to perform this exam inside of a virtual machine. You are going to be asked to solve problems mainly about the configuration of the Kubernetes cluster. This can include, for example, the use of the kubectl or kubectl command and to create or modify existing YAML resource files. A typical question in the CKA exam is to install from scratch a Kubernetes cluster. But don't worry, there's a section in the documentation of Kubernetes that explains step by step the commands that you have to execute in order to make this installation. Other typical questions in the CKA exam are, for example, configuring or fixing some bugs in the existing Kubernetes components. For example, this can include tuning or configuring the etcd database. Remember that the etcd database is a database that contains the state of all the resources that have been deployed in the Kubernetes cluster. It is important to notice that the CKA is what we would say the entry point of the Kubernetes certifications. This means that if you are starting in the Kubernetes world, the CKA would be the first option if you had to choose one of the three certifications. Moreover, if you want to get the CKS, which is the security certification of the Kubernetes, you first have to have the CKA certification. And remember that you have 3 years of validity for the CKA certification. So this means at the moment that you get the CKA, you have 3 years to make the CKA certification. Some of the key points of the exam are: first, you have 2 hours to complete the exam. Second, there are around 24 questions to complete in these 2 hours. And third, you will have 2 attempts to pass the exam included in the same price. Because I already have obtained the 3 certifications, I can tell you that the CKA is perhaps the easiest certification to pass. But don't be taken into by this relatively easiness, because it is very easy to make mistakes in the exam, or it's also very easy to lose a lot of time by finding the right page in the documentation, or by being surprised by some of the questions, for example, in those questions in which you have to fix a Docker file. So one of my advices is to just be very used to go and to navigate through the documentation of the Kubernetes. However, given said that, the less you have to use the documentation, the better, because this means that you are going to be faster at answering all the questions. And this means that you are going to be more likely to reach the end of the exam. And here it is when the thing becomes a bit tricky, because maybe not for the CKA, but in the case of the CKAD and the CKS, I remember that the last 2 questions were relatively easy and they counted a lot. In the end, the success on passing the CKA certification and the other 2 certifications, I would say, is based on 2 key points. The first one is to be very proficient using the kubectl commands, for example, creating a pod, creating a network security policy, and so on. And this requires a lot of practice. And the second one is be very fast and know very well where everything related to Kubernetes resides inside of the Kubernetes documentation. To gain this proficiency at executing the kubectl commands and to know very well which commands you have to use in each of the cases, I have a couple of websites that I would recommend you without any doubt. The first one is called KillerKoda and it is free. Let's have a look to this website. This one is the KillerKoda website, and here you can see that you have different sandboxes. And you have the CKS, CKA, and the CKAD. And there are also other sandboxes related to other technologies. For our case, we are going to choose the CKA. And here you will see that there are different playgrounds, let's say. And for each one of them, you have one scenario to resolve. So here, things that are important are, for example, how to configure the Vim editor. Remember that in all the 3 certifications, you only have access to the Vim editor, so you will have to configure it accordingly. Then things that are important specifically for the CKA are, for example, how to solve an API server crash, or how to reconfigure it when it is not well configured, and some other things related to application misconfiguration, or you can also be told to fix a multi-container issue. But in general, things that are very important is how to install a Kubernetes cluster from scratch, even though here I don't see any question about it, but this is a must. And then other things that are important can be, for example, a config map. This is a typical question. Then also an ingress. This is a very interesting question to study very well because it is present in all the 3 certifications. So if you study for this one, you will have already an advantage for the other remaining certifications. More things to take into account are, for example, everything that has to be with airbag permissions. And also another thing important is how to configure network policy. This one is having the same tricky point as the ingress question because the network policies are asked in all the 3 certifications. And here in the end, you can see, for example, another thing that they can ask you is how to change the priority of the scheduling. The other website that I want to show you is KillerShell. And this one I would say is even more important than KillerKoda. This one is a paid website, on the contrary of KillerKoda, which is a free website. But for KillerShell, we're going to be able to use a simulator that is exactly the same as the one that you are going to use at the day of the exam. Here the questions are more difficult and they are more similar even to the ones that you are going to encounter in the exam. So here we can see that each of the simulators have some questions. For example, for the CKA simulator, we have 25 questions, which is around the number of the questions that you are going to encounter in the exam. And then you also have 120 minutes, which makes that 2 hours, which is the same as the day of the exam. And then here is the tricky point. And it is that the moment that you activate the cluster, you have it available for you to do all the times you want the exam during these 36 hours. And from what I know, you can activate twice these 36-hour clusters. So this means that you can use one on your first attempt, and in case you don't pass the CKA exam, you then have another attempt here in the practicing cluster. So here I am logged in the KillerShell website, and here you can see that I have simulators already purchased and used for the CKA and for the CKAD. Then I also had them for CKS, but they are not appearing here. But for example, let's see, once we complete one of the simulators, we can access then to the solutions of the questions. So obviously I cannot show you all the rest of the page here because this is paid content. But for example, you can see that the first thing that they ask you to do here is to configure your environment. In this case, you can see that there are typical things that you want to do at the moment of starting the exam. For example, making an alias to the kubectl command. And for example, how to do the -- run client -o.yaml in a single command, which is do. Or for example, a very interesting thing is to how to delete one pod, but in a very quick manner, because the time in the exam is limited, and deleting pods, it can take, for example, like 30 seconds or even 1 minute. Another resource that I also encourage you to use are the Slack channels of KillerShell and KillerKoda. In these channels, you are going to encounter other students that are also keen on obtaining these certifications from the Linux Foundation. So here we have the Slack channels of KillerShell. Remember that there are also Slack channels of KillerKoda, but in this case, I'm showing you the ones from KillerShell. So here you can see that it is possible to interact with the users of the channel in case you have some specific question or you want just to share information with that user. But the key point of using the Slack channels is to make your questions and to solve your doubts with other students that are also interested in getting the CKA in this case. And for example, you can also comment with other users if you have had some issue at the moment of doing the exam, or if you have some problem with the KillerShell website and so on. Here it is very interesting to see if other users are having some issue with the environment of the exam, because it is something that is happening. And indeed, at the moment of doing the CKAD exam, all the interface was changed, all the interface of the exam, I mean, and I couldn't complete the exam with the 2 hours. And then I had to complain to the Linux Foundation, and they gave me a second attempt, but without losing that first attempt that I had spent. I wish you the very best to pass this certification. And remember, if you have to pass the CKAD, you have this video from here, and in case you have to pass the CKS exam, you have this other video from here. So again, wish you the best of the lucks, and bye bye.